Welcome, Brittany. Oh, Maeve is here. Wonderful, Maeve. Lovely to know you're here to see you. Janet, welcome. Emma. Aha. Manav, great to see you. Yasmin, wonderful. Noreen, you're all welcome. You're all very welcome. Okay, so I think we will kick off. So I think I actually know everybody who's here so far. We're recording this webinar. I think that's correct, Ivana. Great. So if anybody doesn't know me, I'm Nadine Ferris-France, the Executive Director of IGHN, the Irish Global Health Network. And on behalf of Ivana and all of the team, it's really my pleasure to welcome you to this webinar. We have the wonderful opportunity here to present back the outcomes of the November events that no doubt you were involved in or very interested, wished you could be involved in November. We called it the IGHNX Empowering Women for a Healthier Europe. And that event was co-hosted with the European Institute of Women's Health and Women in Global Health Ireland, and it was co-funded by the EU. So, just for everybody who's joining for the first time around IGHN, it's an independent, mission-driven network that brings people together from all walks of life, health professionals, researchers, NGO practitioners, artists, students, advocates, all together with one purpose, and that is to advance health equity and social justice, both in Ireland and globally, with a particular emphasis, I would say, on the global south. So back to the event in November. Often we have great events. We know events are really important, but it's really wonderful to have some outcomes and some steps, some next steps after people come together. We came together on the 14th and 15th of November, and we had nearly 200 people who joined us in person for day one, which was these short, incredibly beautiful and powerful evidence-based talks that covered very diverse global health themes. And that was followed by a second day where we had 40 participants from around Europe who came together to really to kind of expand on what they had heard and bring that to meaningful conversations that could then take us to what we have today, which is to present, which is the policy brief and the Dublin Declaration. Um, the event itself, just to remind everybody, it was anchored around these four themes, which of course are still as relevant today. And I would say if we're sitting here in 10 years' time, they will be as relevant in 10 years' time. And having been in this 20 years ago, they were as relevant then. So good to notice. Women health and women and leadership, which is around women health workers, being the backbone of our health systems, but remaining underrepresented in decision making, and really looking at the different levels of women's leadership throughout health systems, and looking at some of the systemic barriers that particularly are facing marginalized women. We also looked, theme two was around addressing the health needs of underserved groups. It looked at how health systems could better serve people who are routinely excluded from care. And it also focused on practical barriers and inclusive approaches for groups, particularly groups such as migrants, refugees, and then, of course, in Ireland, Roma and travellers, and people living in poverty or remote areas. Theme three was around health as a human right. And that is the right to health. And we know it's under increasing pressure, the right to health, and I think that particularly affects women. Restrictions on reproductive health rights, shrinking space for advocacy, and never more important than we put human rights at the centre of all that we're doing. And then, last but certainly not least, youth shaping the future of health. Young people, we talk about them being tomorrow's leaders, but actually they're shaping health systems today. And I think as older professionals, it's our duty to make sure that we can hear the voice of young people, that they have the skills and the support to be able to participate in the dialogues that actually change policy. So ahead, and just because of that, to let you know that we had a pre-consultation before the two-day event with youth, and I think Neve is going to speak a little bit to that, where we convened, or they convened, in fact, together a separate youth consultation, and each theme was discussed there. So, today you're going to hear a bit about the policy brief that really outlines the key priorities and the recommendations that came out of IGHN Next EU 2025. Of course, it calls for a stronger gender responsive EU and national policies to advance women's health and rights. The brief also emphasizes, coordinated intersectional action, better data, better research, meaningful inclusion of underserved communities, and of course, investment in community-based care. So, the Dublin Declaration was something that came out of day two. The participants felt it would be really useful to have that. And the Dublin Declaration really summarizes those shared priorities and actions. So in the chat, you'll find the link to both of those documents. And, it's really worth not just reading them. I know it's really hard to be able to read things in this very busy age, but wherever we are as powerful women that come together in webinars like this and spaces like this, to take that with you into other spaces, to print it, to give it to people, to email it to people, especially ahead of the EU presidency that Ireland will hold from July 2026. So enough from me. I hope that was a helpful introduction, but not too long. We have some wonderful women here with us who were also extremely involved in shaping everything that we are presenting today. So I'm first going to introduce four of them. Paula Quigley, medical doctor, lived and worked overseas for the past 30 years, and she's currently technical lead on a with many things in there, which shows you the power and the ability of women: reproductive, maternal, newborn, child and adolescent health and nutrition at DAI Global Health. She's also a member of the core team at Women in Global Health. And we also have Fiona Lawless. She's also a member of the core team of Women in Global Health, working towards gender equity in global health and leadership. And she works as a policy advisor, focusing on health and inclusive data in Sightsavers. Niamh Kennedy is a first-year PhD student at Trinity College, and she's researching something that I hear everywhere I go at the moment. Endometriosis related infertility, such an important topic. She holds a bachelor's in molecular medicine and a master's in women's health, and she's very active in the IGHN student outreach team. And then last is Naomi Riki, specialized in global health advocacy and communications, and she's currently a communications officer on women's health and sexual reproductive health and rights at a Dutch organization, at a German organization, I think, that I cannot pronounce because my German is terrible. Deutsche Stiftung. Oh my God, I'm not even going to try.
No worries, Nadine. I can also not pronounce it. DSW. You go.
DSW. So brilliant. So let me hand over to you guys, and then I'm going to come back and introduce another special guest afterwards. So Paula, will you take us through advancing women's leadership, please? And really sorry to, everybody's going to have 5 minutes to do this, and then we will have some time for discussion.
Thanks very much, Nadine, and welcome everybody. Really great to have a great crowd on this webinar, and apologies in advance. As you can probably tell, I'm in the car traveling, but don't worry, I'm not driving, so all safe. So I'm going to talk you through the first theme, which was about advancing women's leadership. And as Nadine has mentioned, this is, we have 70%, for example, in the health care workforce of women, but only 25% in leadership. So why is this, and what are the major barriers? So there's all sorts of barriers that you're all probably very familiar with, but they really focus around the lack of women-friendly workplaces and having work policies that are women-friendly. There's gender bias, there's the unpaid care work, which of course mostly falls on women. And there's gender-based violence, which, as we know from many surveys that come out every year, is affecting an awful lot of women. So, of course, we need to look at all the issues, what workplace adaptations are needed, and we need to really tackle all forms of gender-based violence. And I think we'll give you some ideas about that in the recommendations. If you go to the next slide, Ivana, thank you. So, really our recommendations are around all these issues. So the first one is really tackling, making sure that there's gender balanced, diversity, inclusive leadership across the EU. So there are many EU policies already in place, and there's a gender strategy, and many entry points here, but the fact is that they're not put into action. So we really need to look at, making sure that women are represented in all the platforms and all the initiatives and all the policies, and that they have a voice. And you're going to hear more about those different types of voices. Then we need targeted leadership pathways, so mentorship, professional development programs, and particularly for underrepresented women, to make sure that they have opportunities to be present, to have their voice heard, to be driving those decisions. Then we need monitoring mechanisms, of course, that really show what progress is being made. And we know that from all the data that comes out, where there is data, it's usually not very favorable. So we need to make sure that we are tracking this, and we have accountability measures when things are not on track. What can we do about it? Then we need much more women-friendly work policies. So, making sure that there's space for women to manage all the different roles that they play in society, childcare, caring for the elderly, etc., but still having those opportunities to progress and having space within their workplace and in the health workforce to make sure that conditions that they're more susceptible to, there's a space for those being addressed. And then finally, the gender-based violence. So we really need to tackle this on all levels, from domestic to workplace and political, and make sure that there are redress measures in place to support women, but hopefully to prevent it happening in the first place. And if we just go to the next slide, we had a wonderful
Looks like she is cutting out in the car, but actually perfect slide for her.
Mine hasn't progressed yet. Ivan, if we go to the next. Sorry,
ahead,
did
Paula,
I cut out there? Sorry. So, okay, great. Yes, sorry, the internet's a little bit unstable on the road. So this was a lovely visual that Teju, one of our core team members in Women in Global Health Ireland, put together, and she did it for all the 4 themes. And it's just a beautiful visual representation of those key barriers and recommendations. You afterwards, browse them at your leisure. And I shall hand back to you, Nadine. Thank you.
Thank you, Paula, and thanks for keeping to time. It's wonderful because we'll have good time then for some discussion. So thank you so much. So following women's leadership, let's now move to addressing underserved groups and health as a human right. So Fiona, would you give us a little tour through that, please? And I think it's interesting as we are listening, all of us as well, things start to look very kind of clean and organized. And when they get to the level of recommendations, they can seem almost like they lose the humanism sometimes in them. So just to remember that these discussions are, the richness of the discussions, and really just thinking about the women that these recommendations might actually support, and the policy places where we can influence things. So thanks a million. Fiona, over to you.
Thanks, Nadine. And I think that's a really great point, particularly when we're talking about underserved groups and like some of the challenges that they face and the barriers that exist. And that was kind of part of the discussion is, marginalized populations really do face barriers, and they have barriers on multiple levels. So whether that's financial and legal barriers, whether it's socioeconomic barriers, whether it's attitudinal barriers, both from society and also from healthcare practitioners, and that can stop people seeking healthcare. Talks about, systemic barriers. So whether you know how to navigate the system that exists, cultural barriers, educational barriers, and all of those at the heart of it is something that stops these underserved groups and marginalized populations both seeking healthcare, but also then it has an impact on the health outcomes. And those people, those women, are experts in their own right around those barriers that exist and how to overcome those barriers. So, like Nadine outlined kind of at the start, we're talking about underserved groups and people who face the barriers, and there's a wide range of them, whether it's migrant women, Roma and traveller women, LGBTQIA plus populations, persons with disabilities. And at the core of it, Europe has a fundamental obligation to address the barriers and to support vulnerable and marginalized populations because they are at higher risk of poor health. But how we need to do that is look at the barriers that exist and then address those barriers. We know that the barriers are many, and we need to make sure that women are able to verbalize those barriers. We also know that things like mental health issues are more common in these underserved populations. It's a critical area where LGBTQIA plus people face heightened risk, and also people who have disabilities have more are at more risk of mental health risks and have challenges in both accessing care in regards to that. A key barrier or a key complication that was kind of a thread throughout this was around data, and particularly for having data that can be disaggregated by whether it's disability status, whether it's economic status, whether it's migrant status or ethnicity. Without that targeted data and the disaggregated data, it means that policies cannot be, first of all, targeted towards these populations, but also you cannot then assess how that is going to be monitored and whether your policy is addressing everyone's right to health. Next slide, please, Ivana. So the table that of people came up with some recommendations about how to address these inequities. So there needs to be an intersectional approach for women who are most impacted by these inequities. And that involves meaningful consultation with the communities and with the people, because as I said earlier, they are experts in their own right. They know the barriers that exist for their communities and the populations, and they also know what can be done to help remove those barriers and help overcome them. So you need to meaningfully consult with the communities and then have the intersectional approaches to be able to address the problems that are faced. You need to involve the communities in policy making. So not just consult with them in a performative manner, but also ensure that they're involved in the discussions about how to make these policies work for the communities that they are representing. We need to strengthen data systems and disaggregation to inform those policies. And like I said earlier, we also need to have that data to monitor whether the policy is working and whether it is impacting all of the people rather than just the easiest to reach. There needs to be funding allocated for targeted research and service design. So obviously, we need to research how and why people are having these issues, but also how the service can be designed in a better way so that the barriers that exist are removed, and ensuring that that funding has a mechanism built into it so that it addresses the vulnerable populations rather than the easier option, which is trying to do a whole of population approach, which often means that these underserved populations are left behind within that. And then to share best practices. And one of the suggestions was to create an EU expert group on women's health and rights that includes participation of representatives from these underserved communities. And that would allow the sharing of best practices, but it would also allow a convening of people who would then be able to inform these policies and serve as a consultation mechanism. Next slide, please, Ivana. So again, you will see here the illustrations that TEDU has done. And I think it's just a really great way. Sometimes it can be quite hard to read a dense policy brief of many pages. And I think these illustrations are a really good representation of the discussions that were had and were captured in a really kind of accessible way that allows people to not have to trawl through a 20-page document. I'm fully aware that not everyone reads policies with the vigor that maybe someone like me whose job it is. So I think that these illustrations are a really great way of being able to get the recommendations and the discussions that were had in a really kind of brief but unusual way. So next slide. And I am going to apologize. You are going to hear my voice a lot, so apologies. So in this topic, we were talking about health as a human right. And there would be quite an overlap between addressing underserved communities and health as a human right. But with this topic, we really wanted to focus on women's health as a human rights issue, and also looking at how the rollback on women's health is a human rights issue. So we're looking at how the rollback around comprehensive sexual reproductive health and rights is threatening women's rights both across the EU and around the world. We want to challenge the misdiagnosis, a lack of research. We know that particularly, as Nadine was saying earlier on, around endometriosis, that's chronically under-researched, and so many women's health issues are under-researched and underfunded for research. As we know, there's been a restriction in SRHR funding and provision both within Europe and more broadly around the world. And we're seeing that with the expanded Mexico City policy, and it's just going to get worse. Gender-based violence remains an issue. It kind of cut across a lot of the discussions that we're having, whether it's women in leadership. Gender-based violence is also very prevalent for underserved communities, and it is a human rights issue. It's often underreported and it threatens people's lives. And then obviously conflicts exacerbate health and safety risks. So we're seeing a rise in conflicts around the world, and that has meant that health and safety, both of women seeking healthcare, but also women healthcare workers, has been exacerbated. Next slide, please. So some recommendations and some calls that came out of this discussion was a call for a comprehensive and overarching EU-wide women's health strategy, which addresses the whole life course, so from young age to older age, and that is aligned with EU values and women's health rights. There's a need to increase research and data collection, and there's a couple of different mechanisms through whether it's Horizon Europe, the EU for Health programs, and joint actions, the European Health Data Space Regulation, and Digital Europe. And basically increasing the research and data collection and routinely collecting data that can be disaggregated. We know that there are gaps in knowledge around women's health, and this is a real way of both researching that gap and also making sure that we have the data to monitor any progress that we're making. There needs to be gender budgeting for intersectional health, social, and educational needs. So a suggestion that came up was including gender budgeting into all EU funding streams. So rather than having a funding stream without an assessment of gender, that it's included in that. And this really touches on how health isn't just a standalone health issue, that there are so many other aspects that impact health, particularly around the social determinants of health as well. A key recommendation, again, you'll hear, is about the elimination of gender-based violence and making that an EU priority. But by making that an EU priority, it also needs to come with dedicated funding, including research funding. Need to develop and fund and implement action plans on women, peace and security in line with the UNSC 1325. So again, recognizing that health on its cannot be siloed. It's integral to women, peace and security. It's integral to the social determinants. We know that there are so many different aspects from social inclusion and education needs that all impact health as a human right. And again, we need to consult with women in policy development. So consulting with women in all of their diversity. So that includes the underserved groups and the diverse range of women who are there, and ensure that their rights and specific needs are acted upon. And again, that is key to ensuring that we're getting the expertise at tables who can give that expertise from lived experience, and really acknowledging that lived experience is an area of expertise as well. And again, we have the really great illustration from Teju. So thanks, Nadine.
Thanks, Fiona, and thank you for stepping in for Peg. And we're sorry she can't be with us due to a family bereavement. So we're thinking about her as well. It's amazing all the things we hold as women. You never know what's going on, the family, the children, all the things that are happening in the background, and still we remain so focused. Okay, so I'm going to hand over next to Niamh and Naomi, and together they are going to present a little bit about the youth pre-consultation, so that we can understand, who was there and what they were discussing, what was important to them. And then I think Naomi is going to take us through the set of recommendations then that came out of the consultation and are included in the policy brief and the declaration, Dublin Declaration. So over to you, Niamh. I think it's you up first. Great to have you here.
Yeah, no, great to be here. So I'm going to talk a little bit about the pre-conference event. So on the 1st of November, what we did was we invited students and young people, and essentially what our goal was, we were trying to, one, engage young people in global health and health equity, but also because a good few members of the student outreach team would then be at the roundtables on day 2 of the conference, we wanted to have a more diverse, well-rounded opinion so we could represent more youth and not just our own personal opinions. So it was great. We actually started with our guest speaker was Robbie Lawler. And I don't know if any of you have heard him speak, but he's fantastic. So that was a great start to the day. And what we did was we went through each of the key themes from the conference, and we broke them down, and we kind of separated into breakout groups, and then we came together and we discussed them all. So we mainly discussed the challenges, and then I think Naomi's going to discuss some of the possible recommendations. And also what I want to highlight was that Tasia had also organized an art display to be going on at the same time. And I think you can see it's in the background of one of those photos. But that was fantastic as well, because not only did it allow kind of conversations about the art and how we can use different channels, but it also meant a lot of the artists came and spoke and participated in those conversations, because, you know, a lot of the time they can get dominated by people who come from the health sectors or global health or politics. So it was great to hear from people from completely different backgrounds. So I'm just going to talk about some of the key challenges that came out through the pre-consultation. And this was really focusing around what are the barriers to young people engaging in health policy or in those discussions. Some of the key ones that came out was a lack of clarity for where young people actually fit in. So in those, where those channels even exist, the pathways to finding them can be quite difficult. We talked about having maybe a lack of confidence and familiarity with how policy development works and how there is or can be a lot of complicated language. And like that, especially if you're not coming from that background, that can just be a further barrier. We did speak about sometimes there being a tokenistic approach. So we said sometimes young people aren't brought in early enough in the discussion, or they're brought on in a one-off basis. And then it ends up maybe feeling that you are not being truly listened to. You're just kind of a tick the box that you've been consulted with. So we said that feeling that young people were seen as not only stakeholders, but direct influencers in health systems, and to include their perspectives wholly. And then we also spoke about kind of structural vulnerability. So as young people can be still establishing themselves in their careers or within kind of their life, their social foundations, that it can limit their ability, their financial ability, but also their time to contribute on a consistent level. So sometimes that might also provide a barrier. But yeah, it was really great. So I'm going to pass over to Naomi.
Thank you very much, Nif. And yes, this is a great hook for the recommendations and the solution, hopefully, that we found during the roundtable discussion. It was, first of all, really energizing and interesting, and I think all of us came back with a lot of ideas. So I think the most important things that we highlighted were that unpaid and unrepresented means unwell. So for a healthy youth, we need representation and we need stability. Not only, as Nif was saying, like being there as tokenistic or being there as an afterthought, for example, during the COVID-19, where all the youth were basically forced to be inside and part of, were seen as part of a problem and a solution, but never tackled as also the beneficiaries of policy practices. So the actions and the recommendation that we came with were, first of all, the biggest one is that there is no youth quotas in many countries. So youth political representation is really, really low. Oftentimes you cannot vote if you're not 18, but your young years starts way before, and also your political participation starts way before. We know that the most active in indeed volunteering activism usually are the youth. Their political ideas are often disregarded, and would be great to also like establish rules, such as we came out with something like no party should get government fundings if they have no youth quotas in their party. There are already countries with youth quotas, and those could be seen as best example for it. Then we also thought this is something that already Fiona touched upon, that we need gender responsive and youth responsive education, and with also a focus on the gender gap and financial outcomes. This means that usually as youth, we don't really get to talk about the financial gap and the gender pay gap that we will face. And I know this sounds more like a problem of youth in general, like young women in general, rather than health and youth, but everything is entrenched in the stability and also the power that you have once you're stable, also economically. We also identified that there is a lack of digital and physical spaces. There is a complete lack of a third space, so a space where you go to not because you need to go to work, or you need to go to school, or you need to go for grocerying, but a third place to hang out as youth and make sense of your own reality. So that's like our proposal is to have more of those spaces, like create not only youth-friendly, as we always say, spaces, but really spaces only dedicated for youth, where yes, they can discuss and also make sense of their own problematics, not only policy related, but also health related. I think that's also why social media were so important, especially during the waves of COVID. And TikTok replaced most of this interaction between the youth. Also, as Fiona was saying about the underserved group, we need to improve youth-focused data collection, and generally also young women data collection, especially in adolescence year, where indeed gender-based violence, for example, is exponential. And finally, when we talk about supporting grassroots organizations, we need to also tackle the unpaid activism and unpaid labor of youth. We understand that youth, now I'm like older than the youth that I used to be when I was doing a lot of activism, and I can stand up for myself a little more. But usually young people are very passionate and very energetic about topics, and health topics are one of those. But we need really to tackle the financial part of young people being involved in the advocacy groups and roundtable and things as such, because only usually the same kind of youth will participate. So we need more diversity, and to make sure this happens, we need to sponsor them properly. And here I was really happy because like I got to travel to Dublin, and everything, for example, was covered. So I think we can go at the end of the illustration slide. I wasn't really following the slides, but more my notes. But you can find everything on the page of Irish Global Health Network. This was a great illustration, and I think it can spark some also ideas. But I think we covered all. And maybe one thing that I need to say is that sometimes as Nif was saying, youth doesn't have confidence and familiarity with difficult policy language, and would be great for the EU to also create some grants and calls that youth can work on without being extremely perfect at it. Like, we all work in NGOs, we try to apply for grants and sometimes we don't even manage to. Would be glad to, yes, have something that is accessible for most of us. Thank you so much for letting us being here and represent the youth.
Thank you, Naomi. And it's weird that we that are really grateful that you were here. And just so you know, even when you get a little bit older, I don't know about anybody else, but perfection is not something that has ever happened yet. Young woman, older woman, still looking for that. Listen, thank you both, Neve and Naomi, for that presentation, and just for your passion and your commitment and willingness to not be perfect. I'm just going to hand over to Fiona, because at the end of that, then, of course, what do we do with that? And Fiona, if you can just kind of walk us through the general recommendations, the next steps, and the Dublin Declaration, the highlight as briefly as you can. And thanks so much.
Sure. So for context, the policy brief and these policy recommendations were very focused on Ireland being the president of the European Council and what actions that they could take, and then also what actions the EU could take more generally. And some of these policy recommendations we'll have mentioned before, but it's things about embedding women's health in all EU policies, particularly when we're coming up to the new MFF, which is the multi-annual financial framework, which, for want of a better description, is the EU's budget and what they're going to do over the next number of years. So there needs to be women's health embedded within that for the EU to take action on that going forward. We need to launch an EU women's health strategy and an EU expert group on women's health and rights. So having a mechanism, particularly with the expert group, where there's a convening process and there's also a mechanism of holding the EU to account on their actions, and particularly with women's health and the rights of women's health as a core part of the work. Need to fund comparative research and community-based care models. So we need to look at how we can fund women-specific research, how we can ensure that we're really getting the information and the research is really helping to drive things forward. We need to promote diversity, inclusion, and intersectionality in leadership and within policymakers. So, as Paula said at the start, we know that women make up the vast majority of the health workforce, but they only are about 25% of those in leadership within the health workforce. And that also goes the same for policy and within government. We see that, there's very little female representation. And if there is not a person at the table, and particularly around if there's not diverse voices at the table, then the policies are not going to address the challenges that affect people, and particularly those who are generally not represented. We need to systematically involve civil society and underserved communities. We're seeing kind of a bit of a rollback against civil society, and that's kind of happening at the same time as a rollback on human rights and the rights, particularly around sexual and reproductive health and rights. So we need to make sure that that space is held to allow civil society and allow these underserved communities to engage in the processes. And like Naomi was saying, to make sure that there's the space for youth and everyone else to get engaged in the process. We need to tackle all forms of violence that impact women and girls. So you would have seen kind of throughout the 4 different themes how there's, gender-based violence is impacting all aspects of women's health, and whether that's women taking up leadership positions, whether it's, women seeking healthcare, whether it's being involved in the discussions and being involved in the policy discussions about it. And it impacts people, both involvement in engaging in the process, but also in health-seeking behaviours. Need to utilise funding streams and strategies. So with the different EU funding streams and strategies, we need to have gender embedded within those, so that there are ring-fenced areas for gender. That a suggestion was that actually within all of these scoring metrics or metrics for proposals, there should be gender embedded within them all, and that gender consideration should be a part of any proposals within any of these funding streams and strategies. and then apply a gender in all policies approach. So gender is a key part of everything that happens. We know that it's a key part of every aspect of healthcare, but it's also a key part of things like the climate considerations, a key part of anything to do with social inclusion considerations. We need to include gender in all discussions about everything that can impact someone. And because of the interrelationship between health and everything else, we need to have a gender in all policies as well as the health in all policies approach, and of course, the budgeting that follows that. So next slide, please. So within the discussions, we wanted to have some call to action and next steps. And what we sent out to everyone who attended, particularly with the round table, was the policy brief with recommendations that we would bring to the Irish government for their role within the EU presidency. At the time, there was an open consultation around what Ireland's priorities for the EU presidency should be. And we all submitted around the findings that we had with this highly collaborative roundtable discussions and brought concrete recommendations to the Irish government in that regard. We really want to maintain visibility and priority for women's health in EU policy discussions and continue that both within the EU and further. We want to advance the work at the EU level, and that is particularly utilising Ireland's EU presidency, but also the other presidencies across Europe that are happening as part of the trio of presidencies. And we did have representation from various Women in Global Health Europe chapters, which will help us link the cross-European recommendations as well. So we hope to get a task force for women's health and via the MEP interest group. And that will be helped facilitate by the European Institute for Women's Health. Like I said, we made the recommendations into the consultation for the upcoming EU presidency, and we also presented them to the Irish government in a presentation last week. And we invited stakeholders and all of you present to share any relevant opportunities, whether it's events, consultations, other entry points that you see where we can continue to drive this process forward. Next slide, please. So the Dublin Declaration was not something we had originally planned as an outcome of these 2 days. But what we found was throughout the policy roundtable discussions on that second day, we saw a lot of common threads and a lot of kind of principles that came across within the discussions that we felt should be used, the principles should be used to embed gender equity within health and gender equity and inclusion within health going forward. So what the Dublin Declaration is it's taking these principles and key actions that can be taken for those principles and is something that could be used within the EU. It's something that can be used globally. It's something that governments can use. It's something that civil society can use. It's a set of principles and actions that can be acted upon. So the key principles that came out were women need to be seen. They need to be safe. They need to be heard. They need to be counted, and they need to be accountable. So what does that mean? To be seen, women need to be represented at all levels of decision making. And that means moving beyond simply having gender quotas, but also ensuring that there's meaningful inclusion of underrepresented groups. So not just a quota based on gender, but there needs to be diversity within that as well. Women need to be safe. So you saw gender-based violence and violence against women was a thread throughout all of the challenges and barriers that we identified. So women in all their diversity experience this, and it's a real barrier to equality and participation because it limits leadership opportunities, it restricts access to healthcare, and it disproportionately impacts women from minority communities. So we need to ensure that gender-based violence is addressed and tackled head on because it has a profound and lasting effect on women's engagement and self-esteem. Women need to be heard. So for too long, women's voices, and particularly those from minority communities, have not been involved in the decision-making process. They're not often sitting at the table. And this weakens policies. a diversity in voices gives you a stronger policy. It gives you an ability to make sure that everyone's challenges are represented and are addressed within these policies. But it also erodes trust, and it ignores the lived expertise that women have, both as leaders, as healthcare workers, and also as users of the health system. Women need to be counted, and this goes back to the data that was mentioned. We need to have data. It's a cornerstone of policy and it's cornerstone of action. We need to have the data to show that there is a problem, but we also need to have the data to monitor whether we're making any progress against our work. And yet, research on health, and particularly gendered health, is centered on a male norm, and it leads to poorer outcomes for women, and it leads to neglect of women's health issues. And then obviously disaggregation of the data has traditionally been confined to sex and age. But we need to have disaggregation that goes broader than that, linked to things like ethnicity, disability status, and gender identity, because these characteristics can actually multiply and compound for any existing inequities. And then we need to have accountability. So commitments to gender equity are essentially meaningless unless we have clear accountability mechanisms. So we need targets, transparent monitoring, and consequences for inaction. You can see on the slide there about the key actions within each of those principles. I'm not going to go through them in detail because I'm aware of time. But the idea of the Dublin Declaration is that it's something that it goes beyond the Ireland's presidency of the EU, and it's something that the principles can be used going forward, because we need to advance this work to make sure that we have gender equity within healthcare. So thank you, Nadine.
Thank you, Fiona. Really, really well presented. And I'm really touched actually just to see it. You know, when you've been involved in something and it's been moving very fast, and then you get to really see, you know, I love the end, like what you just presented there. You know, we want to be seen, we want to be safe, we want to be heard, we want to be counted, and we want to be accountable. And I just think it's really powerful, and also very easy for us to look at that and say, okay, where do I fit in what I'm doing, and the hats that I'm wearing that could actually advance some of those things. I'm going to hand over to my wonderful friend and colleague, Dr. Jennifer Okeke. I mean, we know Jennifer well from her huge participation in all of this, but Jennifer is many things, and she's also an anti-trafficking expert and researcher. She's currently chair of the National Women's Council. I don't think there could be a more important time and a more important organization at this moment to be chair of. She's a leading voice on migration, on gender equality, on human rights, and she works tirelessly to combat human trafficking, gender-based violence, and support migrant women, and as well as that, advocate for systemic change. So Jennifer, I know within all of these themes that we were talking about, you know, trafficking was a big issue, and I'd love for us to hear your experience about, you know, how you think trafficking intersects with gender and migration and access to healthcare in Ireland and across Europe, and also any other reflections you might have based on what you've heard, or I don't know, anything that you're currently thinking when you hear those recommendations. So over to you, Jennifer.
Thank you very much, Nadine, and thank you for having me again. The conference in November was amazing, and I was really honored to be part of it, but thank you for having me today. And then again, when we talk about trafficking, it's just highlighting that gendered nature of it, because oftentimes we talk about trafficking, but the reality is that people really don't understand what we're talking about. It's understanding that it is a gendered crime. And we call it a gendered crime because, again, the majority of the trafficked victims are women and girls, you know. And just to give you a flair of it, you know, just the latest data we have from the European Commission highlighted that 63% of the traffic victim within Europe, I'm going to, the data will be just strictly within Europe, we are victims of, we are women and girls, 63%. And that is a drop from the 93% we had last year. But understanding that 63% of the traffic victims that were recorded in the latest data from the European Commission remained women and girls. And of this 63% is when you look at trafficking in general. When you go to sexual trafficking for sexual exploitation, which has remained consistently the most the most prevalent form of trafficking, that number begin to go up into the 80%, and even within some countries into the 90%. And it's understanding that it is a very gendered crime that has stayed persistently in the past 20 years. It hasn't changed. But oftentimes, again, there is a myth that when you talk about labor exploitation, that it is men. Yes, there's a lot of men in labor exploitation, but it's also highlighting the fact that even within labor exploitation, we are talking about things like domestic servitude, where again, you have majority women. We are talking about the hospitality sector, the care sector, where again, you have majority women. So when you put all of this together, you see that the most trafficked people are women and girls. And that is why we call it a gendered crime. So it's just for us to put that in context. So whether you are talking about trafficking for sexual exploitation, where you begin to see 80-something% and 90-something% women, or trafficking for labor exploitation, where we look at the hospitality sector, the care sector, the domestic servitude, there are loads and loads of women trapped. And again, the majority of these women within the European context are women from migrant background. And that is not to say that European women, even an Irish woman, an Irish girl can be trafficked within Ireland. But the majority of them are people that have come from outside of the EU. So these people have migrated, have left home and moved to Europe, but for one reason or the other, they got trapped in being trafficked. But it's not just the trafficking itself, but it's understanding the harms that comes within it. Because oftentimes when people are leaving their home countries, their home nations to move to somewhere else, they are not moving to somewhere else with the understanding that they will be exploited, or they are walking into harms. But these things happen. But from, I suppose from the perspective of a healthcare professional, it's recognizing what is involved in when you come in contact with a traffic victim. And I'll tell you, even when I was doing my doctorate degree, one of the youngest victims that I interviewed, she was trafficked at the age of 16. But for me, what stood out talking to that particular young lady was the fact that her exploitation could have been prevented. Because again, she came through one of the Mediterranean countries. The boat she was on capsized, and she was unconscious and rushed to the hospital. She was in hospital for 2 days. As young as she was, within a health environment, nobody recognized that this might be a traffic victim. And she ended up in a brothel for 4 years. But if somebody had recognized that there's something wrong here, this person is too young to be traveling alone, maybe we should ask more questions. Could the outcome have been different? Possibly. So it's just recognition of the harm, but more importantly, being able to identify that this is a victim, or this might be a potential victim of trafficking. And that is where the importance of people in the health sector, healthcare professionals, understanding what it means to be a traffic victim, who is a traffic victim. And one of the cohorts of people that are most likely to come in contact with a traffic victim are people in the healthcare. Because at some point, they will need to talk to somebody in the healthcare. So, and that is and these are empirical data. So, and they don't lie. And I did see that from the victims that I interviewed myself. So it's understanding all of the harms that happens. But more importantly is also recognizing the invincible harms, because oftentimes our focus is on the visible harms. Maybe all the harms, the things you can see physically, or maybe the reproductive health harm that has happened to that individual, or the wound you can see. But it goes beyond that. The invincible harms are most times even more harmful than the physical ones you see. But how do you get to understand that? The only way to be able to be aware of it, to be knowledgeable, to be able to identify them is through training. And that is why that's the importance of, I know in Ireland we've been pushing for for modules to be introduced into especially third level institutions. But left for me, I say even at second level institutions, they need to be talking about trafficking, because the reality is that a lot of traffickers, they don't go after, they go after them very young as 16, 15. So even at secondary school level, these are things that needs to be talked about. But, you know, it's introducing modules into third level institutions, especially for people in the health sector. And this is not happening across Europe. It's only individual lecturers, individual professors or doctors trying to bring in people like myself to talk about these things. But, you know, it needs to be a module, a standalone module where especially healthcare professionals, people that are hoping to go into the hospitality sector even, for them to be able to learn about trafficking and all of the complexities that comes with trafficking. So it's a very broad, it is very broad. And I don't know, honest to God, I really don't know why we are not talking about it in the schools and why it's not part of the curriculum. And it needs to be part of the curriculum, to be honest.
Thanks, Jennifer. And I think it's, you know, why, you know, the talking about it, it has to start in spaces like this space and these spaces, which, and we're really grateful for you for bringing it in from the very beginning to make sure that it was important within the discussions. And I think now we have a chance to have our voices heard as we move forward with this very concrete policy brief, very concrete Dublin Declaration, and thankfully highlighting the issues of trafficking within them as well. I'm really conscious that it's as always, there's just so much to try and cover. I'm not sure if anybody has any comments. I see comments already coming in, you know, coming in for the chats there. You know, thank you, Bronwyn. I value the work that's gone into this. We should explicitly name racism, privilege, power, capitalism, patriarchy, misogyny within the conversation. Absolutely. We can't talk about inclusion, diversity, and representation if we're not prepared to sit with the difficult knowledge that depending on where we are on the wheel of privilege, that determines who sits at the proverbial tables, as well as the legacies of colonialism and the remnants. So well said, Bronwyn. Thank you for that. And I think we did have some of those discussions in the round tables. We had some really interesting and frank discussions, and I think we need to keep those discussions up. If anybody else wants to put anything into the chat, please do. You're very welcome. And I guess as we kind of come to the end of this, and I think it's the end of one thing, but I have to say this whole process, I think, has brought us together in a way that didn't really exist before around these important topics of women's health. And I think this is the start of something rather than the end of something. We have these tools with us. We have the presidency coming up. We have the connections now around Europe. We have the young people on board. Last week we were talking to the European movement, who are very keen to help us move forward within the EU and beyond. So I wonder if Paula, do you want to come in there?
I just wanted to say a very quick word,
Yeah.
Nadine, about the event 2 weeks ago in Brussels.
Great,
so,
thank you so much.
Unfortunately, Peggy couldn't be with us today, but we were. She launched the report for a women's health strategy in the EU, and it was launched in the Parliament. I was able to attend it in person with quite a lot of other people. It was really well attended, and lots of other people online. And it's very much aligned with the recommendations that we have come up with this group, and of course that fed into it and vice versa. So it was very much a parallel and a joint process, both of them feeding into each other. But just that the European MEPs are aware of this, and there is some interest. It's always a battle because there's so many priorities for the EU, and everybody's got to negotiate their space. But there is some interest, and we had some really great speakers there. So watch this space. I think the EU hopefully is going to be taking these forwards, and exactly we'll be working with the Irish government to try to get them to push that when they're in the presidency. But thank you.
Thank you. Thanks for that, Paula. And we did actually make the many submissions, in fact, to the Irish government with these recommendations from all of the people who participated, as well as the agencies. So we're looking forward to seeing all of that come out reflected in the priorities when and if they ever come out. And also to say that I think one of the concrete things is there's going to be the setting up of that group, the strategic group that Fiona, you presented, and I think that gives us a channel for moving forward. So I think just as it's literally the top of the hour. One thing I'm going to ask the panelists and also the people participants, just one word, and you can put it in the chat. One word that you're taking away from the conversation today and what we've done as we've started this journey. What's one word that you would just want to share? And I think that's how we will end today, but it will not be the end. It's really the beginning of something. And I really want to thank Ivana and highlight her incredible careful holding of this whole thing to make sure that everybody and everything has been included. And look at these lovely words: collaboration, inclusivity, togetherness. What else have we got? Allyship, beautiful, Jennifer. Solidarity, says Maggie. Women's solidarity, absolutely. Janet, lovely to see your photograph on the slide there. Help me remember your beautiful talk as well, your important talk. Protection.
My chat's not working. Energy.
Energy, wonderful. Protection and equity, sisterhood, justice, responsibility. Wonderful. Really, really fantastic. Transparency. Yes, absolutely. Women rule. Oh, yes, they do. Justice, momentum, justice again, justice coming up again and again. And I think I'm going to add, this is our time. This is our time. Let's do it. Thank you all for your time. And you'll be hearing more on this, and please stay engaged with us, and let's get this policy brief and this declaration into spaces. That is our job from here on, and no better women to do it than all of these. So thank you all. Sending lots of love to everybody. Let's give ourselves some love. International Women's Day is coming up. We can do love. Annette, thank you also to you for all of your contributions, and we will see you all very soon.